Did you know that the single greatest killer of the 20th century didn't arrive with the roar of a cannon or the blast of a bomb, but with the quiet intimacy of a cough in a crowded room? What if I told you that while the world was fixated on the grand, bloody theater of a world war, a far more ancient and indiscriminate enemy was silently gathering its strength, preparing to claim more lives in a single year than the war had in 4? You're standing on a street corner in early 1918. You can feel the crisp air on your cheeks, a chill that still clings to the tail end of winter. The world around you smells of coal smoke and roasting chestnuts from a street vendor's cart. You hear the clatter of horse-drawn carts on cobblestone streets, the distant clang of a trolley car, and the enthusiastic shouts of a newsboy hawking the latest headlines from the Western Front. Few people alive at this moment know that an invisible tide is turning, and even fewer will ever understand how it began. It's a story buried under the noise of history, waiting to be unearthed. As you settle in for our journey tonight, feel free to leave a comment, letting us know where in the world you are listening from and what time it is for you. It's always nice to know we're all in this together, sharing a story under the same digital sky. The world you find yourself in is a world obsessed. Every newspaper, every conversation, every thought seems to revolve around one thing: the Great War. It's been raging for nearly 4 years, a relentless machine consuming lives and resources. The United States, a reluctant latecomer to the party, is now fully committed. Young men are crossing the Atlantic in unprecedented numbers, packed into massive transport ships, heading for the trenches of France. On the home front, life is a whirlwind of patriotic fervor. There are posters everywhere urging you to buy Liberty bonds, to conserve food for the troops, to do your part. You might even find yourself calling sauerkraut Liberty cabbage, a slightly ridiculous but earnest attempt to scrub anything German from your vocabulary. Children collect peach pits and nutshells, which are used to make charcoal for gas mask filters. It's an all-encompassing effort, a national project that leaves little room for any other concern. The enemy is clear. He wears a Pickelhaube helmet and speaks German. Any other threat feels distant, abstract, or simply unimaginable. You see, the medical world of 1918 felt it was on the cusp of conquering infectious disease. The previous decades had been a golden age of bacteriology. Scientists like Louis Pasteur and Robert Koch had identified the microscopic culprits behind diseases that had plagued humanity for millennia: cholera, tuberculosis, diphtheria. There was a sense of profound optimism, a belief that science was winning. Doctors believed they understood the rules of the game. They had vaccines for smallpox, antitoxins for diphtheria. They thought the age of devastating plagues was a thing of the past, a dark chapter belonging to the medieval world of flagellants and miasmas. This confidence, this medical hubris, created a critical blind spot. They were experts in fighting bacteria, but this new thing, this creeping illness that would soon appear, was something else entirely. It was a virus, a concept so poorly understood at the time that it was almost theoretical, a ghost in the medical machine. Historians still debate the precise origin of this viral ghost, with compelling arguments pointing to a Kansas army camp, a sprawling British base in France, or even remote villages in China. In this atmosphere of single-minded focus and scientific self-assurance, the first reports of a new illness are easily dismissed. In the spring of 1918, dispatches from military camps mention an outbreak of influenza, but it's described as mild, a 3-day fever that comes and goes. It's nothing to worry about. The newspapers, if they mention it at all, bury the story on the back pages. After all, what's a little fever compared to a mustard gas attack? The world is looking one way, at the grand, explosive drama of human conflict, while the real danger, the microscopic and silent threat, gathers its forces, completely unnoticed. You can feel the illusion of safety, the comfort of a world that believes it has its greatest enemy in its sights. It's a fragile, beautiful, and tragically normal world, completely unaware that it is standing on the precipice of a biological cataclysm that will change the very fabric of medicine and society forever. The stage is set, not with footlights and curtains, but with crowded barracks, bustling cities, and a global population holding its collective breath for the end of a war, never suspecting a new, more terrible war was just about to begin. Now, let's leave that street corner and transport you somewhere else entirely. You find yourself in the heart of the war machine, the very place that was generating all those headlines. Imagine you are standing in a trench on the Western Front. The first thing that hits you is the smell, a thick, cloying mixture of damp earth, unwashed bodies, disinfectant, and the faint, metallic temps of blood. The walls of the trench are not smooth, but a chaotic jumble of mud, wooden planks, and sandbags, slick with a perpetual, greasy dampness. You feel a constant chill that seeps into your bones, a dampness that no amount of wool can keep at bay. Look around you. You are not alone. You are surrounded by thousands of young men, packed together in conditions that would be unthinkable in civilian life. They live, eat, and sleep almost on top of one another. Privacy is a forgotten luxury. Personal space is a myth. During an offensive, or when sheltering from an artillery barrage, you would be pressed shoulder to shoulder in a dugout, breathing the same recycled, stale air for hours, sometimes days on end. This environment is more than just miserable. It's a meticulously engineered paradise for a respiratory virus. The constant stress of combat, the poor nutrition based on tinned beef and hard-tacked biscuits, and the pervasive exhaustion systematically dismantled the soldiers' immune systems. Their bodies, already pushed to the absolute limit, had little energy left to fight off an infection. A simple cough, in this setting, becomes a weapon. Droplets carrying a pathogen don't just travel a few feet, they immediately find dozens of new, vulnerable hosts. The trenches acted as a vast, continuous human chain, allowing a virus to pass from man to man, battalion to battalion, with terrifying efficiency. It was a biological feedback loop. The war made the men sick, and their sickness made them less effective soldiers, which prolonged the war and kept them in these horrific conditions. An obscure but telling fact is that more soldiers on all sides of the war died from disease than from direct combat. This grim reality was a constant backdrop to the more spectacular violence of the battlefield. Now, zoom out from that single trench. See it as just one small part of a colossal, interconnected network. The war had created the greatest mass movement of human beings the world had ever seen. Millions of soldiers were constantly in motion, moving from training camps to the front lines, from one sector to another, and back to hospitals when wounded. Picture the troop transport ships crossing the Atlantic. They are not cruise liners. They are floating steel boxes, crammed with up to 10,000 men. Hammocks are slung in every conceivable space, inches apart. The air below decks is thick and humid, a perfect incubator. A single infected soldier boarding in New York could, over the course of a 10-day voyage, expose his entire unit. When that ship docks in Brest or Liverpool, it doesn't just unload soldiers, it unloads a virus, ready to be distributed across the continent. Historians still debate whether these intense, crowded conditions actually caused the virus to mutate into a more lethal form, or if they simply provided the perfect amplification and distribution system for a deadly strain that already existed. Think of it like this: if the virus was a spark, the Great War was the most elaborate and effective tinderbox ever constructed. It provided everything the spark needed: fuel in the form of millions of immunologically stressed young people, and a delivery mechanism in the form of a global transportation network of trains and ships. This network was designed to move armies, but it was just as efficient at moving microbes. The war effort had connected the far corners of the world in a way they had never been connected before. A soldier from a small town in Kansas could pass an illness to a soldier from rural England, who could then pass it to a colonial soldier from India, all within a matter of weeks. They were fighting separate enemies on the battlefield, but in this new, silent war, they were all part of one vast, vulnerable body. The very systems built to win the war, the logistics, the transportation, the mass mobilization, were now being co-opted by an unseen enemy. This perfect breeding ground, this global petri dish, was primed and ready. All it needed was the right pathogen to begin the experiment. And that pathogen had already made its first, deceptively quiet appearance. You are back in the United States, in the spring of 1918. The chill of winter is finally receding, replaced by the tentative warmth of the sun and the smell of damp earth and new growth. The world feels like it's taking a deep breath, preparing for renewal. It is against this backdrop of budding trees and lengthening days that the enemy makes its first move. It doesn't announce itself. It arrives quietly, almost politely. It begins in places like Camp Funston, Kansas, a sprawling, hastily constructed military city rising from the dusty plains. Imagine the scene: thousands of wooden barracks laid out in a precise grid, home to over 50,000 soldiers preparing for war. The air is thick with dust kicked up by the relentless prairie wind, mixed with the acrid smoke from the camp's massive manure incinerators. It was here, on the morning of March 4th, that a company cook named Albert Gitchell reported to the infirmary. He complained of a headache, muscle aches, a sore throat, and a low-grade fever. It was a completely unremarkable event. By noon on that same day, over 100 other soldiers were in the infirmary with the exact same symptoms. Within 3 days, the number had swelled to over 500. The camp hospital was overwhelmed. Men were placed on cots in hallways, in hastily erected tents, anywhere they could fit. But here is the crucial detail that lulled the world into a false sense of security. Almost all of them got better. They would be violently ill for about 3 days. A period of intense aches and fever they nicknamed the knock-me-down fever. And then, almost as quickly as it started, it would end. They would feel weak for a while, but they would recover. The camp's chief physician diagnosed it as influenza, a familiar, seasonal ailment. In his report to the Surgeon General, he noted the high number of cases, but stressed the low mortality rate. It was a logistical problem, not a medical crisis. The primary mission of Camp Funston was to train soldiers and ship them to Europe, and a 3-day flu wasn't going to stop that. This pattern repeated itself in military camps across the country. The virus, you see, was traveling at the speed of the American military. As soldiers were transferred from one camp to another by train, they took the illness with them. From Kansas, it jumped to camps in Georgia, then South Carolina, then New York. Each time, the story was the same: a sudden, explosive outbreak that filled the infirmaries for a week or two, followed by a swift recovery for the vast majority of patients. It was a known quantity, or so they thought. The medical establishment filed it away under seasonal grip. It was an inconvenience, certainly, but in the grand scheme of a world at war, it barely registered as a threat. One obscure fact from this period is that some doctors noted a peculiar symptom: a faint bluish tinge to the skin on the face and fingertips, a condition called heliotrope cyanosis. In this mild first wave, it was a fleeting curiosity, a strange footnote. They had no idea it was a horrifying preview of what was to come. As March turned to April, the infected but often asymptomatic soldiers boarded the crowded transport ships destined for France. You can picture them, thousands of young men full of bravado and patriotism, huddled together below decks, sharing jokes, stories, and the very air they breathed. They were unknowingly ferrying a biological stowaway across the Atlantic. By mid-April, the 3-day fever was sweeping through the British, French, German, and American armies in the trenches. It was so common among the British forces that they simply called it Flanders grip. It had a significant but temporary impact on the war. The great German spring offensive of 1918, their last desperate gamble to win the war, is believed by some historians to have stalled partly because so many of their stormtroopers were incapacitated by the flu. But again, it didn't kill in large numbers. It was a nuisance that laid entire divisions low for a week and then moved on. The world had now been thoroughly seeded with the virus. It had infiltrated every major army and dozens of cities across the northern hemisphere. It had tested the locks, mapped the hallways, and learnt the layout of the human population. And then, as summer approached, it seemed to just disappear. The number of cases dwindled. The world breathed a sigh of relief. The spring flu season was over. But it wasn't over. It had simply gone away to change its clothes, to sharpen its knives, preparing for its grand and terrible entrance in the fall. The summer of 1918 is hot and humid, a season of weary waiting. The war grinds on, but the spring flu has faded into memory, a minor footnote in a year of cataclysmic events. For a few brief, deceptive weeks, the world seems to have dodged a bullet it didn't even know was fired. But the enemy did not retreat, it merely regrouped. It went somewhere quiet, somewhere deep inside the machinery of biology, and it re-engineered itself. In late August, almost simultaneously in 3 separate corners of the world, the monster returns. It emerges in the bustling, chaotic port of Brest, France, the primary disembarking point for American troops. It appears in Freetown, Sierra Leone, a key British coaling station on the coast of West Africa, and it arrives at Commonwealth Pier in Boston, Massachusetts, carried ashore by sailors from a naval vessel. This is no longer the knock-me-down fever. This is something new. This is something terrifying. Imagine you were a doctor in a Boston City hospital in early September. A young man is brought in, a sailor who felt perfectly fine this morning. He has a headache and complains of a deep, hacking cough. Standard procedure. You diagnose him with influenza and order bed rest. A few hours later, a nurse calls you back to his bedside, her voice tight with panic. The man's face is changing. You watch, baffled, as a strange, dusky, purple-blue color begins to creep across his skin, starting at his lips and fingertips, then spreading, like ink spilled on blotter paper. This is the heliotrope cyanosis. No longer a fleeting curiosity, but now the unmistakable signature of death. His breathing becomes a desperate, ragged struggle for air. You can hear a faint gurgling sound coming from his chest, as if he's drowning from the inside. His lungs, the very organs meant to give him life, are filling with a thin, bloody fluid. Within 24 hours of his first symptom, he is gone. And then another patient arrives with the same symptoms, and another, and another. This was the hallmark of the second wave, its breathtaking, terrifying speed. A person could wake up feeling healthy, get on a streetcar to go to work, feel a slight chill by lunchtime, and be dead by nightfall. The symptoms were so extreme and so unusual that many experienced doctors didn't believe it was influenza. The profound cyanosis and the pulmonary hemorrhaging, where patients would cough up streams of blood, led some physicians to misdiagnose it as pneumonic plague, or perhaps a new form of cholera. This was a widely known point of confusion, as the medical community grappled with a disease that broke all the rules they thought they understood. It was a humbling, frightening moment for a profession that had grown so confident in its abilities. An obscure but grim detail comes from the autopsies performed on the first victims. When pathologists opened the chest cavity, they found lungs that were heavy, swollen, and sodden with fluid. They were so dark with congested blood and starved of oxygen that they were described as blue or purple, barely recognizable as human lungs. The virus had transformed itself. Scientists still puzzle over the exact genetic event that occurred during that quiet summer. Some theories propose a single, catastrophic mutation event created this hypervirulent strain. Others suggest a process of genetic reassortment, where the 1918 virus may have swapped genes with another influenza strain, perhaps in an animal host like a pig or a bird, creating a deadly new hybrid. This is a central academic debate that continues to this day. trying to pinpoint the molecular switch that turned a common illness into a global killer. Whatever the mechanism, the result was a pathogen perfectly, brutally adapted to its human hosts. It wasn't just contagious, it was aggressive in a way that defied medical experience. It didn't just make you sick, it launched an all-out assault on the body, overwhelming its defenses with shocking speed and ferocity. The phantom that had drifted through the world in the spring had returned as a reaper, and it was ready to begin its harvest in earnest. The world, still focused on its human wars, was about to learn the true meaning of the word plague. Now, you must understand something crucial about the world of 1918. Information is a weapon, as powerful as any artillery shell. Morale on the home front is a strategic resource, as vital as steel or coal. In the warring nations, in Germany, France, Great Britain, and the United States, the press is not free. It has been conscripted into the war effort. Governments on all sides have imposed strict censorship to control the flow of news. In the United States, you have laws like the Espionage Act of 1917 and the Sedition Act of 1918. Under these laws, a newspaper editor could face a hefty fine or even decades in prison for publishing anything that might be seen as disloyal, that might discourage enlistment, or that might simply cast the government's handling of the war in a negative light. So, when this new, terrifyingly lethal illness begins to scythe through army camps and factories, it presents the authorities with a terrible dilemma. Reporting the truth would be disastrous. Imagine you are an American government official. Your nation is sending tens of thousands of young men across the ocean every week. You are asking citizens to buy war bonds and ration food. How can you possibly announce that a mysterious plague is killing your soldiers in their training bunks before they even see a battlefield? How do you tell the mothers and fathers of these boys that a disease, not a German bullet, is the most immediate threat they face? The enemy would see it as a sign of weakness, a vulnerability to be exploited. Your own people might panic, leading to social chaos that could cripple the war effort. The decision is made, consciously or not, to keep it quiet. The newspapers are strongly encouraged to focus on patriotic stories, on victories at the front, on anything but the growing death toll in their own cities. Reports of influenza deaths are often buried, misattributed to pneumonia, or simply not published at all. A conspiracy of silence descends upon the warring world. Now, let this scene dissolve and reform in Madrid, the capital of Spain. The air here is different. You don't feel the same all-consuming tension of war. Spain is neutral, because it is not a combatant. Its press is not subject to the same suffocating military censorship. So, when the flu arrives here in late May of 1918, during that milder first wave, it is front-page news. The newspapers, like El Sol and ABC, report on it freely and in great detail. They write about the strange symptoms, the rapid spread. They report that half the government workforce is out sick. They even report that the King of Spain himself, Alfonso XIII, has fallen gravely ill. For a few weeks, the flu dominates the national conversation in Spain. It's a major public event, discussed openly and without fear of reprisal. Here is where the fatal misdirection occurs. News agencies around the world, like Reuters, are desperate for accurate information. They know the reports coming out of Paris, London, and Berlin are sanitized propaganda. But the news from Madrid is uncensored, so they pick up the Spanish newspaper stories and broadcast them globally. From the perspective of someone living in America or France, it seemed as if this disease was only happening in Spain, or at the very least, was hitting Spain with some unique and terrifying force. It was the only place they were reading about it. The belligerent nations were happy to let this narrative take hold. It was convenient. It located the problem somewhere else, somewhere neutral, deflecting attention from their own unfolding disasters. And so, the world began to call it the Spanish flu. An obscure but telling fact is that the Spanish, feeling unfairly singled out, had their own name for the illness. They called it El Soldado de Nápoles, or the Soldier of Naples, after a catchy song from a popular operetta that was playing in Madrid. The tune was so pervasive, they joked, that it spread through the city as quickly and unstoppably as the flu itself. This accident of geography and wartime politics created one of the most enduring misnomers in history. The 1918 pandemic almost certainly did not begin in Spain. Historians still debate its true point of origin, but Spain is not considered a serious candidate. It was simply the first place where the story of the pandemic could be told, the first country to hold a mirror up to the unfolding crisis, and for that, it was given the blame. The name stuck, a global label born of censorship and circumstance. It's a powerful reminder that the first draft of history is often written not by victors, but by the few who are allowed to speak. And in the autumn of 1918, as the second wave began its global assault, the world was about to need that mirror more than ever. Let's travel now to the city of brotherly love, Philadelphia, in late September of 1918. You find yourself in a city humming with the energy of war. It is the workshop of the world, a powerhouse of industry, churning out ships, munitions, and textiles for the Allied forces. The air is thick with industrial haze and a palpable sense of patriotic duty. Flags hang from nearly every window, and the talk on every corner is of the boys over there and the final push for victory. The pandemic has arrived, of course. It slipped into the city quietly through the Philadelphia Naval Shipyard, where thousands of sailors live in crowded barracks. By the third week of September, hundreds of them are sick, and the first few have died the swift, blue-faced death of the second wave. Doctors from the shipyard and the city's hospitals are sending increasingly frantic warnings to the Office of the Director of Public Health and Charities. A man named Wilmer Cruson. They tell him this is not the flu. They tell him it is highly contagious and uniquely deadly. Director Cruson, however, is a political appointee in a city under immense pressure. The federal government has launched its fourth Liberty Loan Drive, a massive campaign to raise billions of dollars from the public to fund the war. Philadelphia is expected to contribute a huge sum, and the centerpiece of its fundraising effort is to be the largest parade the city has ever seen. The parade is scheduled for September 28th. When reporters ask Cruson about the growing number of deaths, he is reassuring. He downplays the threat, insisting it is just old-fashioned influenza or the grip, and that there is no cause for alarm. He publicly guarantees that the city is safe and that the parade can and must go on. Historians still debate whether Director Cruson's catastrophic decision was born of genuine ignorance, political pressure from federal authorities, or a misguided sense of civic duty to maintain wartime morale at all costs. And so, on September 28th, you are there. You are swept up in a crowd of over 200,000 people, a crush of humanity packed 10 deep along the 2-mile parade route on Broad Street. The atmosphere is electric. You hear the rousing music of John Philip Sousa, played by marching bands. You see Boy Scouts, soldiers, and patriotic civic groups marching with pride. You cheer as famous movie stars like Douglas Fairbanks wave from elaborate floats, urging you to do your part and buy a bond. The air is filled with confetti, cheers, and something else, something invisible and deadly. For every cheer that escapes your lips, you are breathing in the exhaled air of 100 strangers. For every patriotic song you sing, you are inhaling a microscopic storm. You are standing in the largest, most perfect incubator the virus could have ever dreamed of, a citywide petri dish celebrating its own doom. Then, 72 hours after the last band has marched away and the last piece of confetti has been swept from the street, the silence begins. It starts in a few houses, then a few blocks, then entire neighborhoods. The city's 31 hospitals are flooded with thousands of new cases. They fill every bed, every cot, every inch of hallway space, and then they lock their doors. The telephone system collapses under the weight of panicked calls. The morgues fill up, and then the undertakers run out of coffins. The city that was so full of life and noise a few days before is now gripped by an eerie quiet, broken only by the sound of horse-drawn carts moving slowly down the streets. Priests and police officers drive these carts, calling out for people to bring out your dead. A truly obscure and heartbreaking detail reported from this time is that children, with the strange resilience of youth, would continue to play in the streets, sometimes using their jump ropes to skip around the bodies of victims left on the sidewalk, waiting for collection. Within 10 days of the parade, over 10,000 Philadelphians were dead. By the time it was over, the city had buried more than 16,000 of its citizens. The Liberty Loan Parade, an event designed to support a war an ocean away, had become a weapon of mass destruction in its own home. The parade is over. The silence has fallen. You are no longer in the cheering crowd on Broad Street. You are in a small, quiet room inside a row house somewhere in the city. The only sounds are the shallow, ragged breaths of a loved one in the next room and the distant, mournful clang of a single trolley car passing down an empty street. You feel a profound and chilling sense of abandonment. The systems you trusted have collapsed. The hospitals are barricaded fortresses. The doctors are either sick themselves or working until they collapse from exhaustion. The telephone, your link to the outside world, is a dead object. You are utterly, terrifyingly on your own. This scene is repeating itself in millions of homes across the world. Science, the great hope of the 20th century, has gone silent. And in that silence, desperation begins to speak, whispering ancient, hopeful, and often dangerous advice into the ear of a terrified population. Faced with the failure of established medicine, you turn to whatever you can find. It is the 1918 version of frantically scrolling through the internet for a miracle cure. Except your sources are newspaper advertisements, rumors from the neighbor you shout to across the alley, and the folk wisdom passed down from your grandmother. The first line of defense is often aromatic. You place sliced raw onions in saucers in every corner of the house, hoping they will absorb the noxious air. You might even put slices in the socks of the sick, a strange and pungent form of poultice. You hang bags of camphor or garlic around your neck and your children's necks, creating a personal little bubble of scent that you pray is also a shield. It's a bit like wearing a dozen of those pine tree air fresheners you see in cars. Only your life depends on it. The house begins to smell like a strange combination of a salad, a medicine cabinet, and a spice rack. When the smells don't work, you turn to potions and tonics. Newspapers are filled with ads for miracle cures, from patent medicines that are mostly alcohol and opium to Vano's lightning cough cure. You might try something your neighbor swears by, like drinking a shot of whiskey at the first sign of a tickle in your throat. Some advice is more extreme. An obscure but documented folk remedy involved swallowing a spoonful of sugar with a few drops of kerosene on it. Others turn to strychnine, a potent poison, in tiny, supposedly therapeutic doses. The line between medicine and poison becomes terrifyingly thin when you are watching someone you love struggle for breath. A widely known fact is that even the official medical advice could be deadly. The US Surgeon General recommended massive doses of aspirin, up to 30 grams a day, a dosage now known to be toxic. Historians and medical researchers still debate whether this well-intentioned but flawed advice may have inadvertently contributed to the high death toll by causing fluid to build up in the lungs. This frantic search for a cure wasn't just about finding a magic bullet. It was about reclaiming a sense of control in a world that had spun into chaos. It was about the desperate human need to do something. Slicing an onion was an action. Forcing down a bitter tonic was a ritual. These acts, however useless from a medical standpoint, were a way of fighting back. They were a declaration that you would not simply stand by and watch the disease take what it wanted. They were rituals of care, tangible expressions of love and fear. Your home, filled with its strange talismans and pungent odors, becomes a temple dedicated to a single prayer. Please let this pass. You don't know if any of it works, but in the terrifying absence of a real cure, a charm, a potion, a prayer is better than nothing at all. It is the age of desperate hope, where the line between medicine and magic dissolves in the heat of a global fever. You step out of your house, leaving the private world of desperate home remedies behind. The air outside is crisp and carries a faint chemical smell of disinfectant that seems to cling to the autumn leaves. The world you have entered is now a world of hidden faces. As you walk down the street, you see them everywhere. Small white squares of gauze tied across the noses and mouths of your fellow citizens. The butcher, the baker, the streetcar conductor, all of them have become anonymous figures, their expressions obscured, their voices muffled by a thin layer of fabric. This is the new public face of the pandemic. As the failure of individual cures became undeniable, civic authorities stepped in, wielding their one last desperate weapon, the gauze mask. Ordinances are passed with dizzying speed. In cities like San Francisco, Seattle, and Denver, it becomes illegal to appear in public without one. You tie the strings of your own mask behind your head, the rough fabric scratching your cheeks. The air you breathe is immediately warm and damp, smelling of your own breath and the faint antiseptic scent of the gauze. It fogs your glasses if you wear them. Your meticulously waxed moustache, a point of personal pride, is now a damp, flattened mess. But you wear it. Everyone wears it. It is a symbol of civic duty, a visible sign that you are part of the collective fight. Posters appear, showing patriotic figures in masks, with slogans like "Obey the laws and wear the gauze," "Protect your jaws from septic pores." A widely known fact is the strict enforcement in some areas, where mask slackers could be fined, publicly shamed in the newspapers, or even sentenced to a few days in jail. It created a new social contract, a shared vulnerability made visible. You look at a stranger, and the mask tells you that they, too, are afraid, that they, too, are trying to do the right thing. But this unity is fragile. Not everyone complies. As the mandates drag on for weeks, a sense of defiance begins to simmer. You see men arguing with police officers, claiming the mask is an infringement on their personal liberty. In San Francisco, this sentiment coalesces into the formation of the Anti-Mask League, a vocal group of citizens who hold public meetings to protest the ordinance, arguing it is unscientific and oppressive. You can imagine the scene, a crowded hall filled with angry, unmasked faces, defiantly breathing the same air in an act of collective rebellion. It's a strange, bitter echo of the patriotic rallies of only a month before. But this time, the enemy is not a foreign army, it is their own city government. Historians and epidemiologists still debate the true effectiveness of these simple cloth masks, questioning whether their primary function was viral filtration or social pacification. Amidst the compliance and the protest, human nature finds a way to express itself. The plain gauze mask becomes a canvas for personality and status. You begin to see variations on the street. Some women, unwilling to sacrifice fashion for public health, craft their masks from fine chiffon or silk, designed to match their outfits. An obscure but delightful detail from the era is the emergence of decorated masks. You might see a mask with a small, hand-embroidered flower on the side, or perhaps the wearer's initials stitched in colored thread. The wealthy might even sport masks held in place by delicate silver chains or adorned with a few subtle beads, a grim form of jewelry for a plague year. It's a small, poignant act of defiance, not against the law, but against the drab, anonymous uniformity of the pandemic. It's a way of saying, even in this, I am still myself. The gauze mask, this flimsy piece of cloth, becomes a complex cultural artifact, a symbol of solidarity, a flashpoint for rebellion, and a canvas for the stubborn, irrepressible human spirit. The world has become a landscape of muffled voices and hidden smiles, a society held together by flimsy squares of gauze. You've seen the public response, the attempts to legislate and control the spread of the disease on the outside. But now, we must turn our attention inward, to the silent, microscopic battlefield where the real war is being fought, for you and for the doctors of 1918. The most baffling and terrifying mystery is not how the disease spreads, but who it chooses to kill. Every piece of medical knowledge, every ounce of common sense, tells you that a disease should prey on the weakest, the very young, whose immune systems are not yet developed, and the very old, whose defenses are worn down by time. But this flu, this monstrous flu, is breaking that fundamental rule. You walk through a makeshift hospital, perhaps a school gymnasium converted into a ward. The air is heavy with the scent of sickness and disinfectant. You see rows upon rows of cots. On one, a frail, elderly man breathes with a shallow rattle, but he is holding on. On another, a small child, though feverish, seems to be fighting it off. But then you see the others, the ones the nurses are watching with a grim, hopeless expression. They are not the weak or the elderly. They are the strongest among you. They are the young men in the prime of their lives, their bodies hardened by military training. They are the young women, vibrant and healthy, the mothers and factory workers who are the backbone of the home front. They are the ones turning blue. They are the ones dying. It makes no sense. It's as if a predator was stalking through a forest and ignoring the fawns and the old bucks to attack only the strongest, most powerful stags. How could this be? What had gone so terribly wrong inside the very people who should have been the most resilient? The answer lies in a concept that the doctors of 1918 could not have possibly understood. A devastating biological paradox known today as a cytokine storm. To understand it, think of your immune system as a highly disciplined army. When an invading virus enters your body, your immune system identifies it as an enemy. It then sends out chemical messengers called cytokines. These cytokines are like battlefield commanders. They issue orders, telling warrior cells where to go, how aggressively to fight, and, just as importantly, when to stop fighting once the enemy is defeated. In a normal, healthy response, this is a precise, controlled, and effective military operation. The battle is fought, the invader is cleared, and the body repairs itself. But the 1918 virus did something different. When it invaded the body of a young, healthy person with a powerful, peak-condition immune system, it triggered not a battle, but a panic. The cytokine commanders, instead of issuing clear orders, began to scream. They released a torrent, a blizzard, a storm of signals, all of them shouting one frantic, undifferentiated command: attack. The immune system's powerful army went rogue. It stopped distinguishing between the virus and the body's own healthy tissue. An obscure but tragic example of this was the extremely high mortality rate among pregnant women, in some areas reaching over 50%. As the virus turned their uniquely powerful immune systems into a catastrophic weapon against both mother and child, the immune cells, in a frenzy, would flood into the lungs, attacking everything in sight. They destroyed the delicate lung tissue, causing massive inflammation and bleeding. The patient wasn't just being killed by the virus, they were being killed by their own strength. They were drowning in the floodwaters of their own overzealous defense. This is the secret behind the horrifyingly swift deaths. The stronger and more robust the immune system, the more violent the cytokine storm. An older person's immune response might be a bit more sluggish, producing a smaller, less destructive storm that they could potentially survive. But the young and healthy, their bodies, primed for a vigorous fight, unleashed a biological civil war. A widely known fact among epidemiologists is that the 1918 pandemic created a W-shaped mortality curve, with peaks in the very young, the elderly, and a huge, unprecedented spike in people aged 20 to 40. Scientists still debate the exact viral mechanism that triggered this catastrophic immune overreaction. But the outcome was clear. The body's greatest asset had been turned into its most lethal enemy. A secret betrayal happening at the cellular level. far from the reach of any desperate cure or gauze mask. From the microscopic battlefield within the body, let's pull back our focus, away from the cellular chaos and into the gilded rooms where the fate of nations is decided. You find yourself standing in the hall of a palace or a government ministry. The floors are polished marble, reflecting the light from crystal chandeliers. The air is still and smells of old paper, beeswax, and the faint, pleasing scent of pipe tobacco. You are surrounded by men in fine suits and military uniforms. Their voices a low, confident murmur as they discuss strategy, borders, and reparations. You might think that power offers a kind of shield, that the thick walls, attentive guards, and private physicians could keep the chaos of the streets at bay. But the 1918 virus was a radical Democrat. It did not read newspapers, it did not recognize titles, and it certainly did not respect national borders. It was the great equalizer. We have already mentioned King Alfonso XIII of Spain, who fell gravely ill, but he was not alone in his royal affliction. The virus swept through the halls of power on all sides of the conflict. The British Prime Minister, David Lloyd George, contracted the flu while in Manchester and became so desperately ill that he was placed on a primitive ventilator, his life hanging in the balance for several days. His illness was kept a closely guarded secret from the British public. Even the German Kaiser, Wilhelm II, was struck down. The list goes on, from the future American president, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who contracted the flu on a transport ship coming home from Europe and was carried off on a stretcher to the Emperor of Ethiopia. No amount of wealth or authority provided immunity. The virus traveled in the shared air of cabinet meetings, on the hands of couriers, and in the coughs of aides and secretaries. But nowhere was the intersection of the pandemic and power more consequential than in Paris during the spring of 1919. The war is over. The leaders of the victorious Allied nations have gathered to hammer out the terms of the peace. The stakes could not be higher. They are redrawing the map of the world and attempting to build a new international order from the ashes of the old one. At the center of these negotiations is the American president, Woodrow Wilson. He arrived in Europe a hero, an idealist, greeted by cheering crowds who saw him as a savior. He brought with him his famous 14 points, a blueprint for a just and lasting peace without victors, a peace that would not sow the seeds of future wars. His vision clashed dramatically with the aims of the French Prime Minister, Georges Clemenceau, who, having seen his country invaded by Germany twice in his lifetime, was determined to impose harsh, punitive measures to ensure France's security. For weeks, Wilson stood firm against Clemenceau's demands. And then, on the evening of April 3, 1919, in the middle of a private argument with the French leader, Wilson collapsed. He was seized by a violent coughing fit and a raging fever that quickly rose to 103 degrees. His staff tried to downplay it as a cold brought on by exhaustion, but the symptoms were unmistakable. He was delirious, paranoid, and so weakened he could not leave his bed. A deeply obscure but revealing detail is that his personal physician, Dr. Grayson, was so alarmed by Wilson's sudden paranoia and erratic behavior that he briefly suspected the French had poisoned him. When Wilson finally emerged from his sick bed 10 days later, he was a changed man. The vibrant idealist was gone, replaced by a frail, irritable, and strangely obstinate figure. He seemed to have lost his mental stamina. He suddenly caved to Clemenceau's demands, abandoning his own principles on reparations and territorial claims, in a desperate bid to save his one cherished project, the League of Nations. Historians still debate the precise extent to which Wilson's bout with the flu altered the course of the Treaty of Versailles, but many argue that his physical and neurological decline led him to concede to harsher terms against Germany, inadvertently sowing the seeds for future conflict. The invisible enemy had not only claimed millions of lives, it may have reached out from a sickbed in Paris and shaped the very history of the next 50 years. The negotiations in Paris drag on, a slow, contentious process of dismantling empires and drawing new lines on a map that is still smudged with blood. The world, or what's left of it, is trying to exhale. The armistice was signed in November, and you can feel the collective, desperate desire to return to some semblance of normal. People are tired of death. They are tired of fear. They are tired of rationing, of telegrams, of seeing gold stars in their neighbors' windows. In many cities, the mask ordinances are relaxed or rescinded. Theaters and dance halls, shuttered during the terrifying peak of the autumn wave, cautiously reopen their doors. You see tentative smiles on the streets, faces unobscured for the first time in months. There is a fragile, hopeful sense that the worst is finally over. The great monster of the fall has, it seems, retreated back into the shadows. But it has not gone. It has only been waiting for winter's cold embrace to make its final, lingering curtain call. In the early months of 1919, the number of influenza cases begins to tick upward again. This is the third wave, but it is a different beast from the one that tore through the world just a few months before. You might find yourself in a hospital ward again, but the atmosphere is less of frantic panic and more of grim, weary resignation. The patients are still terribly sick, with high fevers and wrenching coughs that leave them exhausted. But you see fewer of the horrifying blue faces, the telltale sign of the cytokine storm. The lightning-fast deaths, the terrifying progression from healthy to deceased in a single day, are now the exception rather than the rule. It is still a killer, to be sure, claiming millions more lives before it is done, but the mortality rate is significantly lower. It is no longer a biological wildfire. It is a bed of hot, stubborn embers that refuse to be extinguished. It's an echo of the second wave's scream, a long, weary rasp that hangs in the air for another year. The reason for this diminished lethality is a subject of intense academic debate that continues to this day. One school of thought argues that the virus itself had evolved from a purely biological standpoint. A pathogen that kills its host too quickly is not as successful as one that allows the host to live long enough to spread it to others. This theory suggests the virus mutated again, this time into a less virulent but still highly contagious form. Another, more widely accepted theory focuses on the human population. The second wave had been so devastatingly efficient that it had already killed millions of the most susceptible people. The survivors, many of whom had been infected and recovered, now carried a degree of immunity. The virus, in essence, was running out of ideal targets. It was now encountering hosts who could put up a fight, whose immune systems had been trained by the earlier encounter. The fire burned less brightly because the most flammable wood had already been consumed. This final wave, however, held a few cruel surprises, reminders of the virus's latent power. One of the most obscure and tragic examples of this occurred in Australia. Due to its geographic isolation and a rigidly enforced maritime quarantine, Australia had managed to almost entirely escape the catastrophic second wave of 1918. It was a rare sanctuary in a sick world. But in January of 1919, as the third wave was beginning elsewhere, the quarantine was lifted. The virus, carried by returning soldiers, finally breached the island continent's defenses. For the Australian population, which had no acquired immunity, this milder third wave hit with the full, explosive force of the second wave. It ripped through their cities, killing an estimated 15,000 people in a matter of months. It was a horrifying real-world experiment that proved the virus was still just as deadly. It was the rest of the world that had changed. This wave sealed the pandemic's place in history, pushing the final, staggering death toll to a number so large it is still debated. Somewhere between 50 and 100 million people. It was the final, grinding act that made it clear this was no single freak event, but a global siege that had lasted for nearly 2 years. The fever, at last, was beginning to break, leaving behind a world that was exhausted, impoverished, and profoundly, irrevocably scarred. The great fever has broken. The world is left weak and shivering, like a patient after a long illness. You are walking down a street in a city that is slowly, tentatively coming back to life. Shops are reopening, their windows a little dusty, their proprietors looking a little older, a little more tired. The clip-clop of a horse-drawn delivery wagon sounds unnaturally loud in the quiet air. But as you look around, you begin to notice something is wrong. The picture is incomplete. You see children, more children than you would expect, playing in the streets without supervision. They are not just playing, they are watching, waiting on front steps for doors that will never again be opened by the people they are waiting for. The virus, with its cruel preference for healthy young adults, did not just kill individuals. It targeted the very foundation of society. It killed parents. This is the pandemic's most brutal and enduring legacy, the silent echo that would resonate for a generation. It created a legion of orphans on a scale that was almost unimaginable, because the flu disproportionately killed people between the ages of 20 and 40, the prime parenting years. It hollowed out families from the inside. In New York City alone, more than 30,000 children lost one or both parents. In Philadelphia, the numbers were similarly catastrophic. Across the country, and indeed the world, hundreds of thousands, perhaps millions, of children were left adrift. You see, society was simply not equipped to handle this. Orphanages, which already existed to care for a steady trickle of parentless children, were suddenly hit by a tidal wave. They were swamped, their resources overwhelmed in a matter of weeks. Imagine you are standing in the hallway of one of these institutions. It's a large, cavernous building that smells of disinfectant, boiled cabbage, and damp wool. The sound of your footsteps echoes on the polished linoleum floors. You look into a dormitory and see a forest of identical black iron beds, each one a small, lonely island in a vast, impersonal sea. The children you see are not the cherubic, rosy-cheeked orphans of fiction. They are quiet, watchful, and old before their time. They have seen things no child should ever have to see. They have watched their parents turn blue. They have listened to the carts in the street. They have learned the hard adult lesson that the world is not a safe place. The system, for all its good intentions, is a blunt instrument. It provides a roof and a meal, but it cannot mend the deep, invisible wound of loss. In the face of this overwhelming crisis, society resorted to desperate measures. One of the most obscure and heartbreaking artifacts of this era can be found in the classified sections of old newspapers. You would see advertisements placed by overwhelmed orphanages or desperate relatives, not for lost pets, but for lost children. They read like ads for livestock, for adoption, 2 brothers, ages 5 and 7, healthy and good-natured. Sometimes they would even be more direct, listing a child's potential as a future farmhand or domestic servant. It was a stark, brutal calculus of survival. Extended families, grandparents, aunts, and uncles absorbed as many children as they could, their own households already strained by loss and poverty. Sociologists and historians still debate whether the trauma of this orphaned generation contributed to the live-for-the-moment ethos of the Roaring Twenties, or if the crisis was largely absorbed by the resilience of these extended family networks. But for every child who found a new home, there were others who simply slipped through the cracks, becoming part of a drifting, unmoored population. This silent, walking wound, this generation of children forced to raise themselves, would carry the secret scar of the pandemic long after the graveyards were full and the world had decided it was time to forget. The children are growing up, the world keeps turning, and now you find yourself in a library years later. The air is quiet and smells of aging paper and leather bindings. You pull a thick history book from the shelf, a volume dedicated to the early 20th century. You run your finger down the table of contents. Chapter after chapter is dedicated to the Great War. You read about the Somme, the Marne Verdun. You see maps of trench lines, photographs of generals, detailed analyses of military strategy. You read about the Treaty of Versailles, the birth of the League of Nations, The economic aftermath. The war occupies hundreds of pages, a vast and detailed monument of ink and paper. And then you look for the other war, the silent one. You might find a paragraph, perhaps a short chapter if the author is particularly thorough, tucked away as a grim footnote to the main event. 50 million, perhaps 100 million dead, and they are a historical afterthought. This is the Great Forgetting, a peculiar and profound case of collective amnesia that settled over the world in the aftermath of the pandemic. How is it possible that an event that touched nearly every family on Earth, that killed more people than the war, could be so thoroughly and quickly erased from public memory? The first reason is a simple matter of narrative. The war, for all its horror, was a story. It had heroes and villains, good guys and bad guys. It had a clear beginning, a dramatic middle, and a triumphant end. It was a human story of courage, sacrifice, and conflict. It generated medals, monuments, and epic poems. A virus, on the other hand, is a terrible protagonist. It has no motive. It has no ideology. You cannot negotiate with it. It is simply a mindless, biological process. There is no glory in dying from influenza. It is a private, messy, and undignified death that happens in a sick room, not a noble sacrifice on a field of honor. As a result, the war provided a ready-made, and in many ways more comforting, story to tell about the era's immense suffering. It was easier to mourn a soldier than a statistic. The second reason is rooted in a deep, collective trauma. You have to understand that the people who lived through it did not want to talk about it. It was too painful, too raw. It was the memory of a loved one's face turning blue, the sound of a desperate, drowning cough from the next room, the quiet dread of waiting for the cart to come down the street. These were not memories to be shared. They were horrors to be buried. This was a war fought by families in their own homes, and the survivors were too exhausted and too grief-stricken to memorialize it. The Roaring Twenties, with their frenetic energy, their jazz clubs, and their flagpole sitters, were not just a celebration of peace and prosperity. They were a frantic, deliberate flight from the recent past. It was a generation shouting and dancing as loudly as it could to drown out the memory of the terrible silence that had come before. Finally, there was a sense of institutional shame. The medical and scientific communities had been utterly humbled. At the turn of the century, they believed they were on the verge of conquering infectious disease. The 1918 flu proved them catastrophically wrong. They had no cure, no vaccine, and for a long time, no real understanding of what was even causing the illness. In the face of their greatest challenge, they had failed. There was little incentive for them to dwell on this monumental failure in their textbooks or medical journals. An obscure but powerful piece of evidence for this forgetting is the almost complete lack of physical memorials. Go to any town in Europe or America, and you will find a statue or a plaque dedicated to the local soldiers who died in the Great War. But you will search in vain for a monument to the nurses, the doctors, and the millions of ordinary citizens who were lost to the flu. Historians and sociologists still debate whether this forgetting was a conscious act of suppression or an unconscious, trauma-induced silence. Whatever the cause, the result was the same. The greatest demographic catastrophe of the 20th century was shrouded in a cloak of silence, its lessons unlearned, its victims unremembered, waiting decades to be rediscovered. Let's step out of the quiet library of the future and into the humming, focused quiet of a laboratory in 1918. The air in here is different from the world outside. It smells not of sickness, but of chemicals, of alcohol from the Bunsen burners and the sharp, clean scent of carbolic acid. You are surrounded by order. Glass beakers and flasks are arranged in neat rows. Polished brass microscopes sit on sturdy oak benches, their lenses aimed at a microscopic world of invisible truths. This is the front line of the scientific war against the pandemic, a place of reason and methodical process, a bulwark against the chaos and fear that grips the streets. Here, In these sterile, well-lit rooms, the world's brightest minds are hunting the killer, and they believe, with an almost religious certainty, that they know exactly what it looks like. You see, you are your entire training, your whole understanding of infectious disease is built on the revolutionary work of the past few decades. Your heroes are men like Pasteur and Koch. You believe that for every great plague, there is a specific, identifiable bacterium. Find the bacterium, and you can create a vaccine or a serum to defeat it. Your Bible in this fight was written in 1892 by a brilliant German physician named Richard Pfeiffer. During a previous influenza pandemic, he had meticulously studied samples from sick patients and discovered a tiny, rod-shaped bacillus in their lungs. He found it so consistently that he declared it, with great confidence, to be the causative agent of influenza. He named it Bacillus influenzae. For 26 years, this was not a theory, it was a fact, written in every medical textbook. So the hunt begins. You and your colleagues around the world are engaged in a desperate, frantic search for Pfeiffer's bacillus. You take samples from the lungs of the dead, from the sputum of the dying. You smear them onto glass slides, staining them with purple dyes to make the invisible visible. You peer for hours through the eyepiece of your microscope, your back aching, your eyes straining in the gaslight, searching for those telltale tiny rods, and often you find them. A thrill of recognition runs through you. There it is, the enemy, exactly where the textbooks said it would be. You carefully isolate the bacteria, growing them in pure cultures on petri dishes filled with a blood-based agar jelly. The goal is clear: grow enough of the killer to develop a vaccine that can be given to the healthy, or an antitoxin to be given to the sick. But a troubling inconsistency emerges, a crack in the foundation of your certainty. Sometimes, in the sputum of a patient dying, the classic Blue Death, you find nothing, a clean slide. Other times, you find the bacillus, but it's accompanied by hordes of other bacteria: Streptococci, Staphylococci, Pneumococci. Which one is the true killer, and which are merely opportunistic scavengers feasting on the wreckage? Even more confusingly, you sometimes find Pfeiffer's bacillus in the throats of perfectly healthy people. If it is the killer, why are they not sick? Then, a different kind of experiment begins to gain traction. A truly obscure and elegant piece of science using a device called a Chamberlain filter. This is a porcelain tube with pores so infinitesimally small they can trap all known bacteria. You take lung tissue from a flu victim, grind it into a saline solution, and force it through the filter. The liquid that emerges is completely sterile, at least by the standards of 1892. Yet, when you inject this clear bacteria-free fluid into a healthy animal, the animal gets sick. The fluid is sterile, yet it carries death. You are now hunting a ghost, a filterable agent, a virus. The word existed, but the reality was a medical phantom. It was something so small it could not be seen with any microscope, something so strange it could not be grown in any petri dish. It was an invisible enemy that broke all the rules of bacteria. This created a fierce schism in the scientific world. Historians of science still debate how much the dogmatic focus on Pfeiffer's bacillus actively hindered research into antiviral strategies during the pandemic's peak. For months, perhaps for the most critical year of the pandemic, the vast majority of medical research, the desperate race for a vaccine, was aimed at the wrong enemy. They were building a fortress against a bacterium, while a virus, the true killer, slipped through the walls, completely unseen. This colossal misdiagnosis was one of the pandemic's great hidden tragedies, a scientific dead end that cost an immeasurable number of lives. You are back in a city mayor's office. The year is 1918. The leather on the chair is worn, and the air is stale with the smoke of 100 anxious cigars. You are looking at a map of the city, and it is covered in red pins, each one marking a reported death. The pins are clustered so thickly in some neighborhoods that they have become a solid mass of red. a stark, visual representation of the disaster unfolding outside your window. You have no resources, your hospitals are full, your doctors are sick, your undertakers are on the verge of collapse. You pick up the telephone to call the state capital for help, for doctors, for nurses, for coffins, for anything. The line is busy. When you finally get through, the official on the other end tells you they have their own crisis to manage. Every town in the state is screaming for help. You try to call the federal government in Washington, but the response is the same. The War Department is focused on the war in Europe, and the Public Health Service is a tiny, underfunded agency with little authority and even fewer resources. This was the brutal reality of public health in 1918. It was a chaotic, fragmented, and hopelessly decentralized patchwork. Health was considered a purely local matter. Each town, each city, each county had its own health officer, often a part-time position held by a local physician. There was no national strategy, no central command, no system for sharing information or coordinating a response. It was every town for itself. You can imagine the result. One city, like St. Louis, might have a proactive health commissioner who closes schools and bans public gatherings at the first sign of trouble. The next city over, like Philadelphia, might have a commissioner who downplays the threat and allows a massive parade to proceed. The virus, of course, does not respect city limits. The inaction of one community could directly lead to the devastation of its neighbor. It was a system perfectly designed to fail in the face of a national crisis. But out of this catastrophic failure, a new idea begins to emerge, forged in the crucible of the pandemic. You see, the world had learned a hard lesson. A pathogen moving at the speed of a steam train and a steamship could not be fought by a public health system that moved at the speed of a horse and buggy. After the fever breaks and the politicians begin to survey the wreckage, there is a dawning recognition that this can never be allowed to happen again. The idea that public health is a national responsibility, even a matter of national security, begins to take root. In the years following the pandemic, you witness a quiet revolution. Nations around the world begin to establish, for the first time, centralized ministries of health. In Great Britain, the Ministry of Health is created in 1919, directly absorbing the old, ineffective local government board. In France, a similar centralization occurs. Even in the United States, with its strong tradition of states' rights, the underfunded public health service begins a long, slow journey of expansion and empowerment. An obscure but crucial part of this transformation was the establishment of international bodies. The flu had been a global problem that no single nation could solve on its own. It made the world feel small and dangerously interconnected. In 1923, the Health Organization of the League of Nations is formed. It is the first permanent global health institution in history. Its mandate is to collect data on infectious diseases from around the world, to standardize vaccines and treatments, and to coordinate responses to future epidemics. It is the direct ancestor of today's World Health Organization. Historians still debate the immediate effectiveness of these early organizations, which were often underfunded and lacked real enforcement power. But their creation represented a monumental shift in thinking. It was a formal acknowledgement that germs don't carry passports, and that a disease outbreak in a remote village in Asia could become a crisis in a London suburb in a matter of weeks. The pandemic had exposed the deadly flaws of a fragmented system, and in doing so, it laid the foundation for the very architecture of modern, coordinated public health that we rely on today. The world had failed the test of 1918, but it was grimly determined to study for the next one. You are no longer a mayor, you are a city health officer. Your office is smaller, tucked away in the basement of City Hall, and it smells of damp paper and stale coffee. Your most advanced piece of technology is a large corkboard map of the city, the same kind the mayor has upstairs. But your map isn't for tracking deaths, it's for tracking disease. When a doctor reports a case of scarlet fever, you push in a yellow pin. For diphtheria, a blue pin. It is a slow, manual, and reactive process. You are not fighting a war. You are cleaning up after a series of small, isolated skirmishes. Then, in the fall of 1918, your map becomes useless. The telephone on your desk begins to ring, and it does not stop. The reports are not of single cases, but of entire households, entire streets falling ill at once. You try to use your pins, but in a matter of days, the map is just a solid, meaningless sea of red. You are trying to track a lightning storm by mapping every single raindrop. The speed and scale of the pandemic has made your methods obsolete, a joke. You are not tracking the enemy, you are drowning in its wake. This profound sense of helplessness, experienced by health officials all over the world, was the catalyst for a fundamental change. The pandemic made it brutally, painfully clear that you cannot fight an enemy you cannot see, measure, or track in real time. The old methods of local, anecdotal reporting were like trying to describe a hurricane by interviewing one person who got wet. To fight a global plague, you needed a new kind of science, a new way of seeing. You needed the science of epidemiology, the study of how disease moves through populations. The question was no longer just how do we treat this person. It became where did this come from, where is it going next, and how do we get ahead of it. This required a new and, at the time, revolutionary commodity, data. Cold, hard, standardized data. In the aftermath, the scattered, informal systems of reporting were gradually replaced by methodical, coordinated surveillance. In the United States, the Public Health Service began requiring cities to submit a weekly telegraphic report, listing the number of new cases and deaths for a range of infectious diseases. This information was compiled and published in the Morbidity and Mortality Weekly Report, a document that continues to this day as one of the cornerstones of modern epidemiology. It was the beginning of a national nervous system for disease. An obscure but fascinating source of data from this period came not from the government, but from life insurance companies. Long before many city health departments could get a handle on the numbers, companies like Metropolitan Life were seeing a catastrophic spike in death claims. Their actuaries, the original data scientists, were among the first to grasp the true, terrifying scale of the pandemic's mortality through the cold, impartial lens of financial statistics. This new flood of data from different sources was the raw material for the birth of a new discipline. Scientists and statisticians began to analyze this information, creating the first sophisticated epidemiological models. They could now map the spread of the virus along railway lines and shipping lanes. They could correlate outbreaks with public gatherings, like the Philadelphia Parade, providing hard evidence for the effectiveness of social distancing measures. They could analyze death rates by age and location, revealing the mysterious W-shaped curve and providing clues about the virus's behavior. Historians of science still debate whether the flu created the field of modern epidemiology from scratch, or merely acted as a powerful accelerant for a discipline that was already in its infancy. Regardless, the result was a transformation. The local health officer, staring at a useless map of pins, was replaced by a new kind of public health professional, an epidemiologist who looked at charts, graphs, and statistical tables. They were no longer just cleaning up, they were learning to predict, to forecast the path of an epidemic, and for the first time, to give the world a fighting chance to get ahead of the next one. The corkboard map is gone. You are sitting at a heavy oak desk in a university library, the air thick with the smell of old books and quiet contemplation. The papers in front of you are not desperate pleas from undertakers. They are neat columns of numbers, statistical tables, and hand-drawn graphs showing the rise and fall of mortality rates across the continent. This is the fruit of the new epidemiology, a cold, precise language for describing a catastrophe. But as you trace the elegant, brutal arc of the W-shaped curve with your finger, you feel a profound sense of intellectual vertigo. Every number, every data point, is a testament to a colossal failure. It is the story of a profession that, in its moment of greatest need, found itself armed with the wrong maps, the wrong weapons, and the wrong understanding of the enemy. Before 1918, you see, the medical profession was riding a wave of unprecedented confidence. You could almost call it arrogance. The past 50 years had been a golden age. The germ theory of disease was triumphant. Doctors saw themselves as microbe hunters, intrepid explorers, charting the invisible world, identifying bacterial culprits, and developing serums and antitoxins. They had unmasked the killers behind tuberculosis, cholera, and diphtheria. They believed, with a deep and satisfying certainty, that they were winning the war against infectious disease. They thought the age of plagues was over, a relic of a dirtier, more ignorant past. The 1918 influenza was not just a medical crisis, it was a philosophical one. It was a humbling, shattering blow to the profession's self-image. It was like a grandmaster chess player who believed he had mastered the game, being swept from the board in 3 moves by a complete unknown. This humbling was the necessary catalyst for a revolution in medical thinking. The first and most profound shift was the one we have already touched upon: the grudging, final acceptance of the virus. The failure to consistently find Pfeiffer's bacillus, combined with the filterable agent experiments, forced medicine to look beyond the world it knew. Virology, which had been a niche, almost theoretical subfield of bacteriology, was thrust into the spotlight. The hunt was on for an enemy you could not see, grow, or, for the moment, understand. This sparked a new era of research, laying the conceptual groundwork for the development of tools like the electron microscope decades later. It was a widely known fact that this failure directly spurred a massive reorientation of medical research toward these mysterious, non-bacterial pathogens. Second, the catastrophic failure of treatment forced a pivot to prevention. In 1918, doctors threw everything they had at the flu, from aspirin to quinine to strychnine, and nothing worked. The hospitals were not places of healing. They were often just way stations on the road to the morgue. The lesson was brutal and clear. Once a pandemic of this virulence takes hold, medicine is largely powerless to stop it in the individual. The only hope is to stop it in the population. This led to a new and powerful emphasis on the principles of public and preventative medicine, on hygiene, on health education, and, as we have seen, on the systematic collection of data. And then there was the immune system. The mystery of why the young and healthy died in such staggering numbers forced a new, more nuanced understanding of the body's defenses. The immune response was not a simple switch that was either on or off. It was a complex, powerful force that could bend under the right circumstances, turn on its host. Immunology became a central field of study, as doctors tried to understand the violent dance between pathogen and patient. Perhaps the most obscure and strangest legacy of the flu was how it expanded the very definition of infectious disease. In the years following the pandemic, a bizarre and terrifying illness began to appear around the world, an epidemic of encephalitis, lethargica, or sleepy sickness. Patients would fall into a statue-like, comatose state for weeks, months, or even years. Many who survived were left trapped in their own bodies, conscious but unable to move. Doctors were baffled, but they noted that the sleepy sickness epidemic followed the exact path of the 1918 flu. Historians and scientists still debate to this day whether the flu virus directly caused this neurological syndrome, or if it merely created a vulnerability that another agent exploited. But this eerie connection forced the medical world to recognize that a respiratory virus could have devastating long-term consequences for the brain, a concept that continues to be a frontier of medical research. The revolution was complete. Medicine had been humbled, but it emerged from the fire wiser, more curious, and armed with a new set of questions that would define its course for the rest of the century. The questions hung in the air of the medical world for decades. a persistent, unanswered echo of the great catastrophe. What was this thing? What was the precise molecular identity of the killer that had humbled the world? The generation that lived through the pandemic slowly passed away, taking their memories with them. The great forgetting gave way to a renewed, intense curiosity, but the ghost remained a ghost. The virus, as far as anyone knew, was extinct. It had vanished from the human population, leaving behind only the scars on our history and the lingering mystery in our textbooks. To study it, to finally unmask it, you would need to find it. And to find it, you would need to go somewhere very, very cold. The story of this search begins not in the 1990s, but much earlier, in 1951. You are a young Swedish pathologist named Johan Holten. You are driven by a burning curiosity to solve this great medical puzzle. You read reports about an entire village in Alaska, an Inuit settlement called Brevig Mission, that was almost completely wiped out by the flu in November of 1918. 72 of the village's 80 adults died in a single week. They were buried quickly by the few survivors in a mass grave dug into the permafrost. The permafrost, you realize, is a natural deep freeze. It is possible, just possible, that the virus lies there still, perfectly preserved in the lung tissue of the victims. And so, you travel to this remote, windswept place, with permission from the village elders. You and a small team spend days digging into the frozen earth, a grueling, manual task in the perpetual twilight of the subarctic summer. You eventually reach the bodies, remarkably preserved by the cold. You take tissue samples from the lungs and race them back to your lab in Iowa, your heart pounding with the hope of discovery. But the technology of 1951 is not up to the task. You try to grow the virus in chicken eggs, the standard method of the day, but nothing happens. The ghost eludes you. You have failed. Decades pass. You, Johan Holten, become a successful pathologist and eventually retire. The mystery remains. But now, in the 1990s, a new kind of science has emerged: molecular biology. You are now another scientist, a man named Jeffrey Taubenberger, working at the Armed Forces Institute of Pathology. You have a new, revolutionary tool at your disposal, a technique called polymerase chain reaction, or PCR. It is essentially a genetic photocopier, able to take a single, tiny, degraded fragment of DNA or RNA and amplify it into millions of identical copies, enough to be sequenced and studied. You don't need a live virus, you just need a piece of its ghost. You begin a painstaking search, not in the frozen tundra, but in dusty boxes of archived medical samples. You find lung tissue, preserved in wax blocks, from an American soldier who died of the flu at Fort Jackson, South Carolina, in 1918. For months, you painstakingly search for viral fragments in this tissue, and then, one day, you find it, a tiny piece of the virus's genetic code. It's like finding a single, legible word on a page of a book that has been burned to ash. This discovery changes everything. Johan Holten, now 72 years old, reads about your work in a scientific journal. The fire of his youthful obsession is rekindled. He knows that the samples he took in 1951 were probably not frozen enough. He knows where the better preserved bodies are. He contacts you, and on his own dime, he returns to Brevig Mission. It is 1997, almost half a century after his first attempt. Again, he gets permission from the elders. This time, he finds the body of a woman who was named Lucy, a victim who was obese, her body fat having provided an extra layer of insulation against any temporary thaws. The lung tissue he extracts is perfectly preserved. He carefully places the samples in preservative and mails them to you. In your high-tech lab, you now have the jackpot. You and your team work for years, using the tiny fragments from the soldier as a guide to piece together the full genetic sequence from Lucy's lung tissue. And in 2005, it is done. The killer is resurrected, not in a test tube, but as a complete sequence of genetic information on a computer screen. The ghost finally has a face. Scientists and bioethicists still fiercely debate the wisdom and the inherent risks of resurrecting a known killer, questioning whether the potential knowledge gained outweighs the danger of an accidental release. The ghost now has a face, a string of letters on a computer screen, a sequence of adenine, guanine, cytosine, and uracil. You are sitting in that lab, looking at the completed genome of the 1918 influenza virus. The hunt is over. But the resurrection is not an end. It is a beginning. It is like an archaeologist finding the Rosetta Stone, a key that can finally unlock the secrets of a lost language, the language of a pandemic killer. For the first time, you can begin to answer the questions that have haunted medicine for nearly a century. What made it so deadly? Why did it kill the young and healthy? Where did it come from? The genetic code holds the clues. You and your fellow scientists begin the painstaking work of reverse engineering the monster. Using modern genetic techniques, you can insert specific genes from the 1918 virus into a modern, benign flu virus. It's like taking the engine out of a vintage racing car and putting it into a modern family sedan to see what happens. When you insert a particular set of genes, the ones that control how the virus replicates, you witness something astonishing. The new hybrid virus reproduces with an explosive, unchecked ferocity that is orders of magnitude greater than any normal flu. It turns the host's lung cells into relentless virus-making factories, destroying the tissue in the process. You have found the molecular basis for its terrifying speed. Next, you turn to the mystery of the cytokine storm. You create another hybrid virus and use it to infect mice in a highly secure laboratory. You watch what it does to their immune systems. The experiments confirm the theory in horrifying detail. The virus doesn't just trigger an immune response. It seems to actively short-circuit it. It causes the immune system to release that chaotic, uncontrolled flood of cytokines, the self-destructive storm that leads to catastrophic lung failure. A widely known fact, established through this modern research, is that the 1918 virus had avian, or bird-like, genetic features. It was a bird flu that had somehow made the jump directly to humans, a rare and dangerous event. Because it was so foreign, the human immune system had no pre-existing memory of it, no playbook for how to fight it. It reacted not with a targeted defense, but with blind, overwhelming panic. This knowledge, hard-won from a grave in the Alaskan permafrost, becomes the blueprint. It is not just an academic exercise in solving a historical mystery. It is a vital, practical guide for surviving the future. By understanding the genetic tricks the 1918 virus used, you can now scan for them in the influenza viruses that are circulating in the world today. Modern pandemic preparedness is built on this foundation. You have global surveillance systems that constantly monitor flu strains in bird and pig populations, looking for viruses that have acquired the genetic traits that would allow them to jump to humans. This is the direct legacy of 1918's failure to see the enemy coming. When a new, potentially dangerous strain like H1N1 or H5N1 emerges, scientists can immediately sequence its genome and compare it to the 1918 blueprint. Does it have the genes for hyperreplication? Does it have the molecular signature that might trigger a cytokine storm? This knowledge has reshaped our entire public health response. The non-pharmaceutical interventions that were implemented with such chaotic and mixed results in 1918, the mask wearing, the school closures, the bans on public gatherings, are now a standard part of the modern pandemic response playbook. But now, they are backed by sophisticated epidemiological